The final sound she heard from the life she had known was the click of a latch. It was not a slam, not an angry crash of wood against frame, but a quiet, precise sound of finality. Behind the door stood her husband's brother, a man whose face was a mask of grim duty. In his hand had been a small leather pouch containing $17 and a folded deed. The paper was crisp, the ink still dark, naming her the sole owner of the Gray Bluff, a jagged piece of rock and stunted pine overlooking the fastest, most unforgiving bend of the Silver Creek. Ilara clutched the pouch in her hand, the coins cold against her palm. Her husband, Thomas, had fallen from the roof of the new meeting hall, a project that was meant to cement his family's legacy in the town of Prosperity Gulch. Instead, it had ended it for her. The family saw her not as a widow to be cared for, but as a burden to be shed. The deed was their solution, a piece of land so worthless it was a joke among the local children. They had fulfilled their legal obligation and washed their hands of her in a single, quiet transaction. She stood on the muddy street, the townfolk of Prosperity Gulch moving around her like a river flowing around a stone. Some offered looks of pity, thin and fleeting. Others, mostly the wives of the town's important men, stared straight ahead, their faces set, pretending she had already vanished. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, a sturdy canvas sack containing a wool blanket and a cast-iron skillet, and the dog that sat faithfully at her feet. Ash, a shaggy gray creature of indeterminate breed, whined softly, pressing his head against her leg. He was all that was left of Thomas, a wedding gift from a happier time. $17, a deed to a rock, a dog. This was the sum of her life. Mr. Gable, the owner of the town mercantile, stepped out onto his porch, wiping his hands on his apron. He was a man whose opinions were as heavy and permanent as the sacks of flour stacked inside his store. "A sad day, Ilara," he said, though his voice held no sadness. "The family has done right by you, all things considered. That bluff is no place for a woman alone. Best you take that money and buy a ticket east. Go back to your own people." His words were meant as advice, but they felt like another door closing. Go back? There was nothing to go back to. Her family was gone, scattered by fever years before. This town was supposed to be her home. She looked from his broad, certain face to the distant silhouette of the Gray Bluff, a dark shape against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. A choice was being made for her by every averted gaze, every whispered comment. They expected her to flee, to become a sad story told on winter nights. Instead, she walked into Mr. Gable's store. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful, mocking note. The air smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and condescension. She did not look at the tickets for the eastbound stagecoach pinned to the board by the counter. She walked past the barrels of salted pork and pickles. Her eyes scanned the tools hanging from the ceiling beams. "I'll need a good axe," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "A double-bitted one, and 100 feet of rope. Also, 2 large sacks of salt." Mr. Gable raised an eyebrow. "An axe? What for? There's barely enough wood on that bluff to cook a squirrel." He gestured to a smaller hand axe. "This is more a woman's size." "I'll take the large one," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. She pointed to a sturdy felling axe with a hickory handle. She added a whetstone, a box of matches, and a small sack of flour to her list. The total came to $9.50. More than half her fortune, gone in an instant for tools to tame a place that everyone believed was untamable. The other customers in the store fell silent, watching the transaction. It was a public declaration. She was not leaving. She was walking toward the wilderness, toward the worthless land they had all dismissed. She was choosing the rock. The journey to the bluff was only 3 miles, but each step was a battle. The sack was heavy on her back, the new axe a clumsy weight in her hand. The town road dwindled into a deer trail, which then vanished into a steep, rocky incline. Ash scrambled ahead, his claws scraping on stone, occasionally looking back to ensure she was still following. The air grew colder as she climbed, the wind whistling through the sparse, twisted pines that clung to the mountainside. The land felt hostile, a place that endured rather than welcomed. She reached the crest as the last light faded from the sky. Below, the Silver Creek churned, a ribbon of furious white water. Before her lay her inheritance. It was worse than she had imagined. The bluff was a wide, flat shelf of granite, scoured clean by the wind. There was no soil to speak of, only cracks filled with moss and hardy weeds. At the back of the shelf, a dark opening gaped in the cliff face, a cave, more of a fissure than a proper cavern. It was a black, unconvincing mouth in the stone. A wave of despair washed over her, so cold and sharp it stole her breath. Her knees felt weak. The town was right. Mr. Gable was right. This was a place to die, not to live. The cave entrance was low and jagged. A steady drip of water echoed from within, and the air that breathed out of it was damp and carried the smell of wet stone and decay. She could picture herself huddled inside, slowly freezing, the $17, now $7.50, a useless handful of metal. The weight of her loss, of Thomas, of her home, pressed down on her until she sank to her knees on the cold rock. Ash nudged her hand, whining, his warm presence a small anchor in the overwhelming hopelessness. For a long moment, she let the despair have its way. But then, something shifted. It was not a thought, but a feeling. As she knelt there, the relentless wind that had pushed against her all the way up the path seemed to lessen. It still howled over the top of the bluff, but here, near the cliff face, the air was surprisingly still. She stood up, her muscles aching, and walked closer to the cave mouth. The rock itself seemed to block the assault of the wind, creating a pocket of calm. She held up her hand. The air was cold, yes, but it wasn't the biting, moving cold of the open bluff. The stone wall was a shield. She lit a match, its tiny flame flickering bravely in the stillness, and stepped inside the cave. The entrance was narrow, barely 5 feet high, and the floor was slick with moisture from the dripping ceiling. The first chamber was small and damp, just as she had feared. This, she thought, was where the animals came to die. But the cave did not end there. A narrow passage led deeper into the rock. She followed it, her lit match held high. The passage opened into a second, much larger chamber. It was drier here, the floor a mix of gravel and packed earth. And it was warmer. Not warm, but distinctly less cold than the air outside. The deep rock held a latent, ancient heat, a thermal mass that resisted the fluctuating temperatures of the surface world. She pressed her bare palm against the wall. It was cool, but it did not leach the heat from her skin like the rock outside did. It was a stable, constant temperature. Then she noticed the sound. It was not the drip of water, but a faint, whispery hiss. Following it to the back of the large chamber, she found a narrow fissure, a crack in the stone that snaked its way up into the darkness above. Holding the flickering match near the opening, she watched the flame pull steadily inward and upward. A draft. A constant, slow, and incredibly dry draft of air was being drawn from the cave and vented somewhere high up on the cliff face. It was a natural chimney. The dampness of the entrance was caused by condensation, where the cold outer air met the stable inner air. The rest of the cave was bone dry. Despair did not vanish, but it retreated, replaced by a grim, fierce spark of resolve. The town saw a worthless hole in a rock. She saw a shield from the wind. She saw stable temperatures. She saw a natural chimney. She saw a home. It was not a home that would be given to her. It was a home she would have to build, stone by stone, with her own 2 hands. The first week was a blur of brutal, punishing labor. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and baking, were raw within hours. She felled the stunted pines that grew in the crevices of the bluff, their wood dense and hard. The double-bitted axe felt like an extension of her screaming muscles. Each swing was a shock that traveled up her arms and into her shoulders. She learned to aim, to let the weight of the axe head do the work, to read the grain of the wood. The crack of a tree giving way was the loudest, most satisfying sound in the world. She dragged the logs to the cave entrance, her boots slipping on loose rock, Ash barking encouragement or warning as she went. She used the rope and a system of simple levers to haul the heavier logs into place, forming the framework for a front wall that would seal the cave mouth. Her palms blistered, broke, and bled. She tore strips from her spare petticoat to wrap them, the blood soaking through the thin fabric. At night, she would collapse onto her blanket inside the cave, too exhausted to eat, her body a single, throbbing ache. Sleep was a dark, dreamless pit from which she woke each morning stiffer than the day before. Slowly, painstakingly, a structure began to take shape. She built a low wall of stacked stones, mortared together with a mixture of clay she found near the riverbank and sand from the cave floor. It was slow, back-breaking work. She carried the stones one by one, their jagged edges cutting into her already wounded hands. She hauled buckets of clay and water up the steep path. She mixed the mortar with a stick, her arms burning with the effort. But the wall grew. It was ugly and uneven, but it was solid. Inside this new, walled-off section, which served as a sort of enclosed porch, she built a fireplace. She used the flattest stones she could find, creating a hearth and a firebox that vented directly into the natural fissure she had discovered. The first time she lit a fire, the smoke hesitated for a moment, curling in the chamber before being drawn up into the rock with a soft whoosh. It worked. The smoke was pulled away, leaving behind only the radiant, life-giving heat. That night, for the first time, she was truly warm. She sat before the crackling flames, the stone walls around her glowing in the firelight, and a quiet, fierce pride settled in her heart. She had made fire. She had made warmth. With the main shelter established, she turned her attention to other systems. Water was a constant struggle. The drip near the cave entrance was unreliable. So she spent 2 days hauling flat stones and more clay mortar, building a shallow, wide basin on the bluff outside to act as a rainwater catch. She lined it meticulously with a smooth layer of clay, packing it down until it was watertight. It was a gamble, dependent on the weather, but it was better than the treacherous daily climb down to the churning river. Food was the next challenge. The bluff offered nothing but a few hardy berries. So she began the monumental task of creating a garden. She built a 3-foot-high stone retaining wall inside the second larger chamber of the cave, near the entrance where a sliver of daylight could reach. Then, bucket by bucket, she hauled soil up from the river valley. Each trip was a grueling test of endurance. The path was steep, the bucket heavy. It took her a week of relentless work to fill the small, 10-by-4-foot raised bed. To this precious soil, she added compost from fish guts and wood ash from her fire. In this dark, protected earth, she planted the few potatoes and turnips she had carefully rationed. It was a subterranean garden, a secret patch of life hidden in the heart of the mountain. It was the fish, however, that became her primary focus. The Silver Creek was rich with trout. She fashioned hooks from bent nails and used twine for a line. She spent hours on the riverbank, her hands numb with cold, catching fish after fish. She ate what she needed fresh, but the rest was for the future. In the dry, drafty back chamber of the cave, the one with the natural chimney, she built racks from willow branches. She cleaned the trout, split them open, and salted them heavily with the precious salt she had bought from Mr. Gable. Then she hung them on the racks. She kept a small, smoky fire of green pine boughs burning at the base of the chimney fissure. The dry, moving air pulled the smoke up and over the hanging fish, slowly curing them, turning their flesh a rich, dark amber. The cave filled with the pungent, oily smell of wood smoke and curing trout. It was the smell of survival. It was the smell of foresight. A month after her arrival, her supplies ran low. She needed more salt, more flour, and she had decided to risk the last of her money on something that seemed like madness: chickens. She walked back into Prosperity Gulch, a different woman from the one who had left. Her hands were calloused and scarred, her face leaner and tanned by the wind. Her clothes were stained with dirt and pine pitch. The townspeople stared. Whispers followed her down the street. She ignored them. In the Mercantile, Mr. Gable looked her over with a critical eye. "Still alive, I see," he remarked, a note of surprise in his voice. "Come for that ticket east yet?" "I need 20 pounds of salt," she said, placing her coins on the counter, "and a sack of chicken feed, and I'd like to buy 6 of your laying hens." Gable laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Hens? In a cave? Elara, you'll kill them in a week. They need sunlight, a proper coop. And 20 pounds of salt? What in God's name are you doing up there, pickling the whole mountain?" A trapper named Brant, who was leaning against the counter, chuckled. "Heard a rumor you're drying fish in that hole, stinking up the whole cliffside, calling the bears down. We're starting to call you the Fish Witch of Gray Bluff." The name hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Fish Witch. She felt a flush of anger, but she pushed it down. She met Gable's mocking gaze with a calm, steady one. "The hens will be fine," she said simply. He shook his head, still smirking, but he took her money. Carrying a clucking crate of chickens back up the bluff was even harder than hauling the logs had been. But as she settled the birds in a small, stone-walled pen she had built in the warmest part of the cave, their soft clucking was a sound of life, a promise of eggs, a defiance of the town's mockery. The nickname stuck. When children saw her from afar, they would point and shout, "There's the Fish Witch!" The women of the town would whisper about her as they gathered at the well. They said she had gone mad with grief. They said she lived in filth, communing with animals. The story of her buying the chickens and the mountain of salt became a town legend, a cautionary tale about a foolish woman who refused sensible advice. A hunter once climbed partway up her path, ostensibly to check his traps. He saw the neat stacks of firewood, the rainwater cistern, the solid wall sealing the cave. He smelled the smoke and fish. "You're a stubborn one," he yelled up to her, "but winter will break you. That rock will suck the life right out of you. No one can survive a winter on Gray Bluff." She simply watched him from her doorway, the axe in her hand, until he turned and left. But as autumn deepened, turning the aspen trees in the valley to shimmering gold, Elara's world shrank to the rhythms of her own creation. Her days were a cycle of labor and quiet satisfaction. She tended the fire, fed the chickens, checked the curing fish, and gathered firewood. The woodpile grew into a massive wall, a bulwark against the coming cold. Inside the cave, the hens began to lay eggs, small brown miracles she cradled in her palm. Her subterranean garden yielded a small but precious harvest of pale, sweet turnips and hardy potatoes. Her hands were no longer soft, but they were strong. She was alone, but she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of her small, ordered world, a kingdom of stone and fire and foresight. The deep winter arrived not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as a fist. The first blizzard screamed out of the north, a wall of white that erased the world. For 3 days, the wind howled like a hungry wolf against the bluff. It tore at the pines and threw sheets of snow against the cliff face. But inside her shelter, the storm was only a sound. The stone walls did not tremble. The fire in her hearth burned steady, its heat radiating through the chamber. The smoke was drawn cleanly up the fissure, a silent testament to the mountain's secret gift. Her animals were safe. The chickens clucked softly in their stone enclosure, pecking at the grain she scattered for them. Ash slept soundly by the fire, his flank rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. She had water from melted snow she collected at the entrance. She had smoked fish, potatoes, and fresh eggs. The world outside had become a chaos of wind and biting cold, but her small world was warm, ordered, and alive. She had smaller tests before the great one. A pack of wolves, drawn by the scent of the chickens, circled the bluff for 2 nights. Their howls were a mournful, terrifying sound. But her walls were stone, and the heavy door she had fashioned from 3 layers of pine logs held firm. Ash's deep, ferocious bark from within was enough to keep them at bay. Another time, a thaw followed by a sudden freeze coated the entire bluff in a treacherous sheet of ice. For a week, she could not leave her shelter, but her systems held. She had enough food, water, and firewood inside to wait it out. Each small victory solidified her trust in what she had built. She was not just surviving, she was prevailing. Then came the Great Freeze of '83. It began after the blizzard, when the skies cleared to a brilliant, merciless blue. The temperature plummeted. It dropped far below zero and stayed there, day after agonizing day. The river, the mighty Silver Creek that had never been known to stop, began to choke on its own ice. The fast-moving water froze in place, the rapids silenced, the churn stilled into a jagged landscape of white and pale blue. The town of Prosperity Gulch, which depended on that river for everything, was caught completely unprepared. Down in the valley, conventional life began to break. The freeze was like a hammer. Log cabins, built to withstand normal winters, proved inadequate against such a deep and persistent cold. The chinking between logs cracked. Frost grew on the inside of walls. Families huddled around their fireplaces, burning through their woodpiles at an alarming rate. The town's single well froze solid. People tried to hack through the thick ice of the river, but their axes bounced off the surface as if it were iron. Livestock, left in barns that were not built for such temperatures, began to die. The weaker ones went first, then the stronger. The sounds of suffering carried on the still, frigid air. Roofs, heavy with snow from the blizzard, began to groan and sag under the weight. The new meeting hall, the very building Thomas had died creating, developed a long, ominous crack down its main support beam. The confidence of the town shattered like thin ice. Their preparations, their sensible homes, their community wisdom, it was all failing. Up on the bluff, Elara was insulated from the worst of it. The thermal mass of the mountain meant that while the air in her walled-in porch was cold, the inner chambers of the cave remained at a stable, survivable temperature. Her fire needed less wood to keep the space warm. Her rainwater cistern was frozen, but she had anticipated this, filling every bucket and pot she owned with water before the freeze set in. She melted snow when she needed more. Her animals were warm. Her food stores were secure. The rows of smoked fish hanging in the back chamber represented more protein than the entire town likely had left. She was not fighting the cold. She was living within a fortress that the cold could not breach. The wind could scream, the temperatures could fall, but the heart of the mountain remained steady. She was an island of warmth and life in a world that was freezing to death. The first sign of the town's desperation came on the 5th day of the freeze. It was late afternoon, the sun a pale, useless wafer in the sky. Ash suddenly lifted his head from his place by the fire and let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on the door. Ilara quieted him with a hand on his head. She listened. Faintly, through the thick wooden door, she heard a desperate, frantic scratching sound, followed by a weak cry for help. She unbarred the heavy door and pulled it open a crack. The cold that rushed in was a physical blow. Huddled on her doorstep, half buried in a snowdrift, was a woman. It was Martha, the wife of the trapper Brant, the very man who had mocked her in the store. Martha's face was blue with cold, her shawl frozen stiff around her shoulders. She was sobbing, her body racked with shivers. "Please," the woman choked out, her words frosting in the air. "My children, we have no food, no wood. My husband, he went hunting 2 days ago. He has not returned." Ilara looked at the woman's desperate face. She remembered the sneering laughter in the mercantile. She remembered the nickname, Fish Witch. For a fleeting moment, a bitter, cold satisfaction washed over her. They had called her a fool, and now their foolishness had brought them to her door. She could close it. She could hoard the resources she had bled for, the food she had painstakingly preserved. It was her right. They had offered her no kindness. Why should she offer them any? But the moment passed. She saw not the wife of her mocker, but a freezing mother. She saw not a representative of the town that had cast her out, but a human being on the brink of death. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a simple, unavoidable duty. To turn her away would be to become as cold and unforgiving as the stone around her. "Get inside," Ilara said, her voice firm. She pulled the woman into the warmth of the cave. Martha stumbled in, her eyes wide with disbelief, and collapsed near the fire. Ilara gave her a blanket and a mug of hot turnip broth. Then, without a word, she pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped her face in wool, and took up her axe. She loaded a small sled she had built with a precious, carefully measured portion of her firewood. She added a dozen smoked fish, wrapping them in cloth. "Show me where you live," she told Martha. The journey down into the town was a descent into a frozen hell. The cold was a knife. The snow was deep, and pulling the heavy sled was exhausting work. When they reached Martha's cabin, it was colder inside than it was in Ilara's cave. 2 small children were huddled under a pile of thin blankets, their faces pale and still. Ilara did not hesitate. She rebuilt the fire, the dry pine catching quickly. She showed Martha how to flake the smoked fish into the broth to make a nourishing soup. She left the rest of the wood and the fish, turned, and walked back out into the brutal cold, disappearing into the swirling snow before Martha could even properly thank her. News of the rescue spread through the frozen town like a wildfire. It was a spark of impossible hope. The foolish woman in the cave, the fish witch, had food. She had firewood. She was alive and warm. The next day, a delegation arrived at her bluff. It was led by Mr. Gable himself. His face, usually so ruddy and confident, was pinched and gray. His fine wool coat seemed to offer little protection against the profound cold. With him were 2 other town elders. They looked exhausted and defeated. They found her not huddled in a damp hole, but standing in the calm, sheltered space behind her stone wall, calmly splitting firewood. The contrast between her organized, functional homestead and the dying town below was staggering. Mr. Gable's eyes darted everywhere, taking in the massive woodpile, the sturdy door, the faint, savory smell of smoke that clung to the air. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the silent air. "Ilara," he began, his voice stripped of its usual condescension. "My son is sick, a deep fever. The doctor says he needs to be warm, and he needs nourishment. We have nothing. Our wood is gone. Our stores are frozen." He stopped, his gaze falling to the ground. He looked up again, his eyes meeting hers, and the pride that had defined him was gone, replaced by a raw, humbling desperation. "We were wrong," he said, the words a quiet admission of utter failure. "We called you a fool. My God, we were the fools." The men behind him nodded, their faces grim. They stared into the cave opening behind her, catching a glimpse of the firelight dancing on the warm stone walls. They could feel the radiant heat even from where they stood. They saw the neat stacks of supplies, the orderly rows of hanging fish in the deeper chamber. They saw not a hovel of madness, but a fortress of brilliant, practical wisdom. It was a world built by the hands they had dismissed, a sanctuary created from the land they had called worthless. Ilara looked at the men who had orchestrated her exile, who had mocked her resolve. There was no triumph in her heart, only a deep, weary ache. She saw their shame, their fear for their families. Revenge was a luxury she had never had the time or energy to consider. Her work had never been about proving them wrong. It had been about staying alive. She simply nodded. "There is food," she said, her voice even. "Take what you need for your families." She gestured toward the cave. "And bring your sick here. It is warm inside." She did not say, "I told you so." She did not demand an apology beyond the one already given in their desperation. Her victory was not in their humiliation, but in her ability to offer grace. Her actions were her only statement. She had built a world strong enough to save the people who had tried to throw her away. The immediate aftermath of the Great Freeze was a time of quiet revolution in Prosperity Gulch. As the temperatures slowly rose and the river began to break apart with thunderous cracks, the town came back to life. But it was a different town. The survivors, humbled and grateful, now looked to the Gray Bluff, not with scorn, but with a profound and silent respect. They no longer called her the Fish Witch. They called her Ilara, and they said her name with a reverence once reserved for the town founders. Mr. Gable's son recovered in the steady warmth of her cave. Gable himself became her most fervent advocate. He sent supplies up to her, not as charity, but as trade. Her smoked fish, once a subject of ridicule, was now a prized commodity, known for its flavor and keeping qualities. Men from the town came to her, not with advice, but with questions. They asked her about building with stone, about finding clay, about how she had known to build where the wind could not reach. She answered them simply, sharing the knowledge she had earned with her own blood and sweat. The town began to change. New homes were built with stone foundations dug into hillsides, using the earth itself as insulation. People began to build rock walls as windbreaks, and started stockpiling wood, not for one winter, but for 3. The lessons of the Gray Bluff were being etched into the very structure of the community. Her shelter was no longer seen as a strange folly, but as a landmark, a testament to a different kind of wisdom. The story of the woman who survived in the cave spread to other settlements, carried by trappers and travelers, becoming a frontier legend of resilience and ingenuity. Ilara herself changed little. She continued her quiet, rhythmic life on the bluff. She expanded her garden, traded her surplus eggs and fish for things she could not make herself. She remained apart from the town, but she was no longer an outcast. She was its anchor, its quiet conscience. People would make the climb to her bluff simply to sit and talk with her, to feel the profound peace of the place she had created. They saw that what she had built was not just a shelter against the cold, but a life of purpose and quiet dignity, wrested from a place of utter despair. Years later, when she was an old woman with hands as gnarled and strong as the roots of the pines, she would sit by her fire and watch the lights of Prosperity Gulch twinkle in the valley below. The town was larger now, and stronger. Its buildings nestled intelligently into the landscape, prepared for any hardship the mountains could throw at them. She had not sought to teach them, only to survive. But in surviving, she had shown them everything. Her legacy was not written in a book or carved on a monument. It was in the solid stone walls of the town's new schoolhouse, in the well-stocked pantries of its homes, and in the quiet respect the people had for the unforgiving beauty of the land. She had been given a worthless rock, and from it she had built not just a home, but a future for them all.